Thank you. I'm very honored to be here moderating such an important panel with such illustrious guests. So beginning to my immediate right, we're joined by Van R. Newkirk II, who is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where he covers politics and policy with a focus on health policy, civil rights, and environmental justice. This year, he was named one of the 5 winners of the American Society of Magazine Editors ASME Next Award for Outstanding Achievement by Magazine Journalists under the age of 30. Welcome, Van. Thank you. Tracy Jarrett is an Emmy-nominated Peabody Award-winning producer covering politics and DC-based policy for Vice News Tonight, the Emmy Award-winning nightly newscast from Vice Media and HBO. And in August 2017, she produced the Vice News Tonight award-winning Charlottesville, Race and Terror. Welcome, Tracy. Oh, I realize I'm not going in order. Sorry about that. Valeria Fernandez has been reporting on Arizona's immigrant community and the immigration debate for over 15 years. She is a recipient of the 2018 American Mosaic Journalism Prize awarded by the Heising Simons Foundation for freelance journalists doing long-form narrative covering underrepresented or misrepresented communities. Welcome, Valeria. And Ken Schwenke is a journalist and developer on ProPublica's News Apps team, covering hate crimes and white supremacist movements. Previously, he worked on the New York Times Interactive News team and the Los Angeles Times Data Desk. Welcome, Ken. So, Van, let's begin with you. You write about public policy, and you've said that you apply a justice and a civil rights framework to each story. Tell us more about why you do that and what it takes.
I think, so the reason why I do that, and let's back up to explain what a civil rights and a justice framework is. For me, it's looking at every single policy that we have, and this runs the gamut from, agricultural subsidies to healthcare to even defense spending, and thinking about each, now in the last 50 years, each department of our government is bound by civil rights laws, right? Everybody has to have a civil rights department. They have to be held in compliance. And actually one of the, I think the underreported stories of the past 50 years is how many pieces of our government have not been in compliance. So for me, it's important, this is one of these stories of our time, is looking at both the government complicity in the way our racial structure is set up in this country, and also the things they have done, the way things have changed. And for me, the ultimate goal is covering just how much access people have to the basic rights promised in our Constitution. And so using that framework in every single instance that we can, thinking about every single policy choice in terms of who has access to the government, who is franchised or not, that's the only way we can really take stock of this most basic piece of civics and citizenship. And that's the basic premise and foundation of all the other journalistic work that we do, I think.
So you recently wrote in the Atlantic's issue commemorating the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King, and you wrote about the way in which the popular narrative has come to treat the assassination as almost a milestone that then created an upward trajectory, and almost as that the achievements had been realized, but that you say that that's actually a false narrative. Can you tell us more about the ways in which the media has used narratives around race that have been misleading?
Well, this is one thing where I think an objective analysis of objectivity is actually interesting. If you ask people, journalists, people across newsrooms across the country, if they agreed with Dr. King, they would say yes. right? That's considered to be somewhere in the non-objective opinion, right? It's okay to say, okay, I agree with King. And lots of people would say they did. But if you look actually back at the country in 1968, when King was alive and then assassinated, and when he was doing his work, he was a deeply divisive figure. He had much bigger disapproval ratings than he had approval ratings in the Gallup polls. It was not considered to be a safe, not neutral opinion to believe in and agree with King. And I've always been interested in just how journalism, as a country, has shifted towards accepting King and some version of his project to be foundational for this modern age. He's considered almost a modern founding father. Journalism itself has taken King, and in order to place him in this neutral perspective, basically taken all of the edge away from him, taken all of the sort of controversy out of his positions, viewed him more as a granite statue than as a person. And what we did with the King issue was to go back and really dig through not only his own work, but journalistic works at the time, look through our pages of our own magazine and see just how the country has evolved. And it was a good exercise for this.
What are some tangible things that reporters can do to do a better job of covering race? And so concurrently, what would a paradigm shift in the way journalism treats the issue of race look like?
I want to go back to the Kerner Commission. People are still talking about the Kerner Commission report. Came out 50 years ago, 2 weeks ago, 50 years and 2 weeks ago. And one of the things that was mentioned in that report was how assumptions about people of color are baked into our journalism, how we bake in inferiority, especially about African Americans in that report. But all people of color there's lots of times we use language that is simply, it dehumanizes people. We use terms that have little to no meaning when we want to make people comfortable. We say things like racially charged, which means absolutely nothing, nothing at all. We, for some reason, in order to avoid both defamation lawsuits and controversy, have shied away from saying racism or calling things racist or even having some sort of useful euphemism for that. And a lot of that has been in the favor of creating a public project where we are comfortable talking about race so long as nothing changes. And of course, if we are journalists and we want to challenge the public perspective and opinion, we want people to be changed. We want them to change the way they're thinking, change the way they understand things, challenge power, apply a lens of skepticism to every single piece of American life. And this is one where I think journalism has not held that skeptical lens and has contributed to basically a crystallization. We've frozen in time our racial understanding, which in turn lends to how frozen our actual racial situation on the ground is.
Thank you for that. Let's move next to Tracy. So Tracy, you were a producer on this landmark piece of journalism that Vice News Tonight put together about Charlottesville, now nominated for a Peabody Award. You had stunning access, quite frightening access, I think I can say. Can you tell us, and I know you've brought a clip as well, so can you just tell us a little bit about what you're going to be showing and kind of what led up to the documentary part that you worked on?
Yeah, so basically our correspondent, Ellie Reeve, had been following the alt-right for 2 years, and a group of us thought, this could be a really interesting thing that's happening. And honestly, it was our assistant producer, Joe, who said, this is kind of interesting. Maybe we should go and just feel this out. And one of the really nice things about working for Vice is they're willing to take those kinds of risks in terms of just going to check out a story, right? So some news platforms like network news is not as willing to maybe try something like that, but we were very lucky to have permission to just go see what was going to happen. And we get the access question a lot. How did you get to follow the alt-right so closely? How did you get to be there for every moment? And the truth is, we just asked. I think a lot of people get nervous to ask, but just sending a message over Facebook can get you the kind of access that we ultimately had. And so the clip that we brought is a clip that was after the march after Heather Heyer was killed, when we wanted to go and follow up with Chris Cantwell, who we'd been following as an organizer of this alt-right protest, and we wanted to see sort of, okay, you came in, we've already talked to you about this plan that you came into the weekend with, this is how things unfolded. What do you think now? And so ultimately, we needed to find him after everything happened, which we also didn't expect to see firsthand, and ask him his thoughts. And so the clip that we have is finding him about 2.5 hours outside of Charlottesville, where he was hiding out, and asking him, okay, how do you feel about the fact that somebody was killed? How do you feel about the way that you're being represented? Do you think that this was nonviolent? And we thought it was important that if we were going to air this piece, that we needed to know sort of his perspective on everything that had just happened.
All right, so I came pretty well prepared for this thing today. Keltec P3AT, 380 ACP, Glock 19, 9mm, Ruger LC9, also 9mm, and there's a knife. Well, I actually have another AK in that bag over there. You get lose track of your fucking guns, huh? I'd say it was worth it. We knew that we were going to meet a lot of resistance. The fact that nobody on our side died, I'd go ahead and call that points for us. The fact that none of our people killed anybody unjustly, I think, is a plus for us. And I think that we showed our rivals that we won't be cowed.
But the car that struck a protester, that's unprovoked.
That's not true, and you know that it's not true. You've seen the video. So
I've seen a video.
Yeah.
I don't know much about it.
I understand
Can
that
you describe what the video appears to show?
Okay. So the video appears to show someone striking that vehicle when these animals attacked him again, and he saw no way to get away from them except to hit the gas. And sadly, because our rivals are a bunch of stupid animals who don't pay attention, they couldn't just get out of the way of his car, and some people got hurt, and that's unfortunate.
So you think it was justified?
I think it was more than justified. I can't believe the amount of restraint that our people showed out there, I think was astounding.
What do you think this means for the next alt-right protest?
I say it's going to be really tough to top, but we're up to the challenge.
Wait, why?
Why?
Tough to top? I mean, someone died.
I think that a lot more people are going to die before we're done here, frankly.
Why?
Why? Because people die every day, right? I mean,
But not like of a heart attack. I mean, violent death.
Well, people die violent deaths all the time, right? Like, this is part of the reason that we want an ethno state, right? So, like, the blacks are killing each other in staggering numbers from coast to coast. We don't really want to have a part of that anymore. And so, the fact that they resist us when we say, hey, we want a homeland, is not shocking to me, all right? These people want violence, and the right is just meeting market demand.
So Tracy, as a producer, you have the skill of thinking, 1 or 2 steps ahead. When you're in that room, what was going through your mind?
We did not have the luxury of thinking 1 or 2 steps ahead. Mm-hmm. First off, when we got there, we didn't know what to expect. And so the only thing that sort of was within my power as a producer was to, one, let our senior producers know where we were and to say, hey, if we're not out by X time, call, this is where we are, send someone. And then the other thing was to make sure that it was, in that particular scene, it was myself shooting one camera, our camera person, Zach, shooting the other camera and doing sound, and then Ellie, our correspondent. And so the thing that we basically had to establish before we even went into that room was if anyone's uncomfortable at any point, we're out. And that was sort of the only thing within our control. So when we got into the room, we're in a hotel, he closes the door, and we did not know until we were well into our conversation with him that he had all of those weapons on him. And so basically, when that happened, we sort of just had to look at each other and you know, and let each other know you have to signal if you need to leave. I think for me, I was a little bit nervous going into the situation as a minority because I was thinking, okay, well, this guy off the bat's not going to like me very much, and I don't want to aggravate him or make it harder for us to do our job. But what I noticed initially was we went in and, you know, he's puts his hand out to shake my hand, and that put me at ease. I think it put Ellie at ease. It put our DP, Zach, at ease because it was an understanding that we were there for business, and so was he. He wanted to get his message out. He wanted to get his point across. And as long as we let him do that, he was going to be understanding of what we needed while we were there as well.
So to that point of he was there to get his point across, how did you and your team look at covering this event as it was unfolding and hearing from one of the organizers? How did you grapple with the idea that, you know, what this white nationalist movement wants is attention? You know, we're here giving him covering it as news, but ultimately it ends up being a platform. What kind of calculations did you think about how to not, inadvertently help spread a message of hate?
Well, I would say that, you know, there had not been a lot of in-depth reporting into the alt-right before this piece. I think a lot of interest really sparked after people saw with their own eyes what was going on in a very real way. I think that this piece had a lot of impact in opening people's eyes to say this is not just something that's very small and we can ignore and that will have no impact. So I think going into it, it was sort of like, well, how do you even expose what's going on that people are sort of dismissing and writing off? I think that after this piece aired, is where that question really began to matter to us. It was, we don't want every piece to be promoting what the alt-right is doing. I think this particular piece was important because it gave people sort of a window into a world that they weren't even sure really existed.
Thank you. Valeria, you are the co-director and producer of the documentary Two Americans. It parallels the story of Sheriff Joe Arpaio and a 9-year-old U.S. citizen whose parents were arrested by the sheriff's deputies during a workplace immigration raid. It aired on Al Jazeera America in 2013. And you've covered immigration in Arizona for more than a decade. I know you've brought a clip from the film as well, but tell us more about how the documentary came about and how you were able to gain access to the then sheriff.
Well, the documentary came about because at that time, I was an immigration reporter, actually a general assignment reporter in a small newspaper in Spanish, covering day-to-day how Sheriff Joe Arpaio was starting to unfold this new strategy of going against undocumented immigrants. And it was sort of like all of these press releases. He did like 180-degree turn. You know, in 2005, he wasn't talking about immigration, and then when he saw that it was something that resonated with voters and other politicians were winning races, like the county attorney, with the promise of stopping illegal immigration, he said, you know, I have to get on this vote right away, and partnered with the federal government, who gave him, his officers, the sort of possibility to arrest undocumented immigrants. And without going into all of the details, through a 287G program that now Trump wants to resuscitate, they started going into neighborhoods, they started raiding businesses, and the community was terrified and in fear. I mean, families wouldn't send their children to school, and they will, you know, unfortunately, some of the people that were leaving their jobs, the raids will happen usually around 5, 6, when people were picking up their kids or they were leaving work. He was flooding neighborhoods with patrol cars. Sort of, there was a sense of urgency that we needed to show that to the rest of the country. And this started in 2008. And at one point, it happened in my own neighborhood. And, you know, he will stage, and this is, I want to really highlight this because he will stage in shopping center areas this whole sort of presentation for the media. He will call us, he will invite us to come and film the people being detained. But that also drew neighbors in the community, lots of Latinos, immigrant families, and his supporters. And what we're starting to see among the supporters is that there were people that were coming with weapons, and there were people that had, frankly, racist ideas jumping into this bandwagon, and that started to evolve. That's why we decided to, work on this film, and we did it for more than 6 years, and it's been, it's been circulating. We continue to show it, because I think that is still so relevant to the reality today. So the clip that we're gonna see right now shows us a little bit of the kind of speech that Sheriff Joe Arpaio was using at that time. And you're probably gonna recognize, or you probably heard about this before. We were the first people to film it. And I don't think that I don't want this to be like a sort of a gotcha kind of moment. We caught you saying something racist. But it's sort of emblematic of the type of audience that he was trying to reach to and the type of sentiment that he was playing to. So we can watch.
This man has bucked the odds to keep you safe, to keep me safe, to keep our children and our neighborhood safe. And I am so pleased and honored to welcome Sheriff Joe here.
Sheriff Joe, I was just wondering, since illegals keep re-entering, you can drop them off and they keep coming back in, are you or do you plan on using some of these concentration camps to hold them because they keep re-entering and killing us?
Well, Sheriff Joe,
we already have it.
My dad told me that if I didn't improve at school, he was going to send me to a concentration camp. And I got my concentration real quick.
I already have a concentration camp. Andy, you gonna cover me on this too? It's called Tent City.
Arpaio sees this as a huge political issue that he can exploit, because hatred and fear to him equals votes.
It's the power of the people, remember that. The power of the people to get things done in this country. Thank you.
So as far as you are concerned, you guys are doing a public service.
We investigated, arrested, and detained 33,000 illegal aliens since we started this program 2.5 years ago.
Have all of them been deported or in the process of deportation now?
We don't keep track, so we don't know what ICE does with these people when they pick them up off our hands.
Anything else you want to raise tonight?
Well, the only thing I have to say, I've been a sheriff for 17 years. I am taking a little heat on my crackdown on illegal immigration. The U.S. Justice Department launched an investigation, but it doesn't hurt me because the people of this country are not stupid.
Yep.
I've laid my foundation many years ago with the pink underwear and the tents and the chain gangs. That's why I survived.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
He's a master of sound bites, and he's a master of spin. Hey, I got the pink shorts. I got the tents. You want to come out and see the tents? And people forget about the question.
So we did CNN a favor.
Yes, we did. You did.
Let's see how they play it. And nothing to hide.
So he has nothing to hide. What was the response from by the time the film came out and you were able to capture that exchange, was there any official response from Arpaio?
Well, recently I had an opportunity to interview him again for an article I did on the shutting down of Tent City. And I'm sorry I didn't explain that, you might not know. Tent City was an outdoor jail that we had in Arizona, where a number of Latinos were segregated in a certain area, outdoor area, so they could be turned into the custody of immigration officers. I mean, the official justification was that they were there waiting to be turned over to the custody of any agencies, but it turns out that when you do a public records request, most of the people segregated in an area were Latinos. And then they had, of course, areas for other people. So the response we got, I asked Arpaio for an article on the shutdown of Tent City. You know, do you take back that comment that you made about comparing your jail to a concentration camp? And he said, you know, why everybody's so fixated with that? What does it matter if I said that? People kept reelecting me, right? So that's what should matter. That was his answer. And they did. They reelected him for 6 times until he lost the past elections with a combination of a Latino vote and Republicans that actually were tired of a lot of the expenses in which this county incurred because of the lawsuits, over $150 million. So I think that, you know, the sort of politics that Arpaio plays, you know, are politics of the spectacle. It's almost theatrical in a way because it's being used to detract media attention from other issues, more important issues that we need to be looking at. While he was conducting these raids, and there was a Pulitzer Prize award-winning investigation by the East Valley Tribune, it turns out that they find out they were not investigating sexual crimes against minors that were happening mostly in Latino communities. While all of this was happening, misspending was happening. Money was being taken, you know, it was supposed to be used in the jails, it was used on the sweeps, and, you know, abuse of power was happening. If you stood against the sheriff, he pressed charges against you. So I think that for us, at times, covering the former sheriff of Maricopa County as reporters, we had a hard time when we were invited to, hey, I am going to parade 150 inmates from the indoor jails to the outdoor jails in pink underwear, you know, come and see it. We had to make sometimes the difficult decisions. What do we do with this? Do we report? Do we continue to feed sort of this loop of reporting? And the thing is, like, sometimes it was hard to look away because, yes, people were being abused in the process.
I want to ask you also about the experience that you've had. You report for English language news sites as well as Spanish language news. What are the differences in terms of how both of those different language outlets approach the issue of immigration and of race in general?
I think that when you're reporting for Spanish-speaking audience, and sometimes that audience is bilingual and they get the news also in English, you really have a very clear picture of who that audience is. That audience is the person who has a mother that needs a pro bono immigration attorney. That audience is the person that has someone in immigration detention, is the person that can access medical health services because they don't have legal status to qualify, is you know, the father of a girl who now has to pay out-of-state tuition. So it's really like a lot of community journalism. It's very clear to you that you're there to serve that audience and that they have this need for information that is kind of almost a matter of, I mean, okay, I don't want to exaggerate, but yeah, life and death sometimes. So you're very close to that audience. You're working in that community, and I see that with a lot of the reporters out there in the Spanish media and in other ethnic media. You know, you kind of have to be a little bit of a jack of all trades. So you're going to, you know, the fundraiser for, I don't know, the lottery club here and there. Then you're going to the city council meeting. Then you're going to the school meeting, and that I think provides you an access that feeds you then a lot of important stories because the community have a relationship of trust with you. And I think a lot of reporters in the mainstream that cover communities, community reporters, you know, have the same sort of experience. And it's so important because of the relationship of trust and the permanence. One thing that I mentioned before is it is also really tough. I don't know if you've seen the clip with Jorge Ramos, a very famous anchor from Univision, who was sort of attacked by President Trump. And, when I saw that, I was like, oh, yeah, that's like we've been dealing with that in Arizona since forever. My first day at the state legislature, I approached the Speaker of the House to ask him a question, and he says, "You work for La Voz. Go back to Mexico." And I'm from Uruguay. Yeah, I know. But that's, I'm not the first reporter to say that. A lot of us go through that. And sometimes, thinking about the project from ProPublica, Documenting Hate, it sort of made me aware of the many instances in which I was attacked, and I didn't even know that was an instance of hate. Moments in which you're interviewing someone, they hear, the moment you open your mouth, they hear your accent. They start, don't talk to her, or they start getting in your face and they start getting physical. Are you even legally in the country? So I had many, many moments that out of the blue, people attack me. And not physically, but getting in my face and verbally sort of being abusive. I see my students now who are also Latino. I was so shocked with one of them told me, he went to the state legislature to cover a protest in favor of DACA, and there were counter-protesters. And sometimes, yes, there are people of neo-Nazis and white supremacist beliefs among those groups. And I said, why didn't you go to interview the other people? And he says, I was too afraid to approach them because he looked too much like the people that were supporting DACA. He was fearful that they will attack him.
Ken, tell us about Documenting Hate. Collaboration, more than 120 news outlets.
Something like that.
Yeah, tell us how the project came together and what is the scope?
Yeah, so in the run-up to the 2016 election, ProPublica worked on a project called Electionland, where we wanted to report on the process of voting and problems people have voting, and things like voter ID laws and the age of machines and budgets and things like that. And we're doing it again this year. But by the end of that election, we spent our time creating information that sort of hadn't existed before, right? We combined data from a hotline called 866-RVOTE, where you can call and ask the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law questions about whether you're being disenfranchised at that moment of your vote. We got information from text messages from people directly using a texting bot set up by John Keefe, who was at WNYC at the time. And we just had people combing through social media. And we used this and we put it all into like one database, and we sent these out as tips to newsrooms in the run-up to the election and during the election day. And after the election, we heard anecdotal evidence, as did many people, that hate crimes were on the rise. And my boss, my editor, Scott Klein, asked me if I thought we could use the tactics that we had put together for Electionland and try to refocus that on hate crimes and hate incidents. And so we started by going to civil rights organizations like the ADL, the Southern Poverty Law Center, CARE, asking them for data that they've been keeping for years on crimes for their constituent communities. And we put a form on the internet. And we asked news partners who also wanted to report on hate crimes and hate incidents to put that form on their websites and to write about this and to sort of get people to tell us of times where they've been victims of hate crimes or hate incidents, where like hate crime is sort of a legal term, which is, if I attack you because you are black, right? That is a hate crime, right? If my reason for doing it, if but not for the fact you were black, I wouldn't have attacked you, that's a hate crime. Or I didn't, or I destroyed your property and I left racial epithets, right, in spray paint on your property, which happens startlingly frequently. That's a hate crime. But if I punch you in the face because you smack your gum loudly and you sit next to me and I hate you, that is not a hate crime, right? And I get questions about that a lot. And so the other thing is sort of like hate incidents, right? So, being told, go back to your country, which if you mine our text databases, a couple of our news partners have done, is a really strongly recurring phrase. I mean, in many variations, happens over and over again. Or, being screamed at or followed around a store. A gay person wrote into us and said that somebody just followed them around the store screaming at them the whole time. Anti-gay slurs. And these are these sorts of things that, go unreported for the most part. Some of them aren't crimes. And the ones that are crimes, maybe they don't tell the police about them because maybe they don't trust the police. And really, really frequently, we wrote a story about this, when they do tell the police don't mark them down as hate crimes, right? So the federal government has been required since 1990 by the Hate Crime Statistics Act to keep statistics on crimes that evidence bias on a bunch of categories. And the DOJ said, okay, we'll have the FBI do it, and the FBI is like, we'll make this part of the Uniform Crime Reporting Program, which I'm sure many of you know has its own problems. Sort of requires people, police departments to mark down on forms. Most states require that they mark down on a form, was this a hate incident? What kind of bias did this exhibit? And by sending, FOIAs to hundreds of police departments and having lots of conversations with them, they just don't do it. And so we've been collecting this information because there was a lack of information, and we wanted to look into it more.
In asking members of the public who've had these experiences or have witnessed them to come forward and report them, what have you learned about what kind of trust it takes for those people to participate in the project, either with the outlet you work with, ProPublica, or any of the partners?
A lot. For example, most of the Spanish speakers who report in through Univision, right? They don't perhaps know or trust ProPublica. A lot of the anti-Semitism comes into ProPublica. And it really matters that you have an outlet that I think people feel that they can trust. And to be able to point to reporting that you've done to say that we've reported on this, our partners have reported on this in a fair way. And one of the things that I've learned is that a lot of people just want to write in, that things like this happen to lots of people, right, including me, as a gay man, right? But it happens to a lot of people, and a lot of people just want to tell someone and then never talk to you, which I'm sure we've all had that sort of experience. But there are people who will write in really detailed information about stuff that happened to them, and you call them and you say, hey, can we talk? And they're just like, absolutely not. I put in my phone number there, but I did not want you to call me. And you can get around that. You can talk to them. You can send them emails, linking to stories that you and partners have written, talking about why you want to write about this, and that you want to tell the story for all these reasons. But ultimately, a lot of people don't actually want to talk, and they don't want to have their name. One of the things is people write into us, but we say we will absolutely not use your story and your name without contacting you and getting your permission to do so, because we don't want to re-victimize people. And so a lot of people just don't. I don't know I feel like I should have checked how many we have before I got on stage, but the last time I looked, it was about 4,000, and so probably around 5,000 stories at this point, and just half of them, I'm sure, just won't talk to you or don't want to talk about it.
Thank you. I want to put a few questions to the whole panel, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience, so please think of them. But I wanted to ask, Van, you mentioned dehumanization in the way that some journalism outlets have written about people of color in the past. We've seen, for example, National Geographic going back into their archives and taking responsibility for the fact that the way they handled reporting on, any continent except Europe, essentially, and people within the United States, communities of color, was harmful. As we think about this issue of trust and how necessary it is for the future of journalism, what is the utility of outlets going back and looking at what they may have done in the past, and being public about changing the way they're going to be approaching specifically the topic of race?
I think that National Geographic initiative to go back and audit all of their coverage on race was something that every newsroom should probably do. They came across some really awful stuff, and it's not just about coming across the awful stuff. It's about just taking stock of what the entire industry has done, who's contributed to what, and really like the dehumanization doesn't occur through one story. It doesn't occur through one bombshell. I like to point to one of the reasons why I got into journalism was looking at the journalism around Ferguson and Michael Brown, and how I thought so many mainstream great outlets just totally dehumanized a young black man. And that doesn't just occur in that one story. It's the entire breadth of the language that we use, and it's across every newsroom. And also, what Nat Geo did there is they exposed to the world how not diverse they were. And I think that should spur reflection among readers. Okay, what have I been reading and consuming over the entirety of my life, and how has that shaped me? So I think if we all did that, we would sort of be able to, it's not just a navel-gazing exercise. It helps consumers understand where our biases lie, and in turn where theirs lie.
Anyone else on that one? No. Okay.
I second.
Oh, yeah.
I agree.
Well said. So when we talk about hate, and Ken, what you said you're terming as incidents of hate, we also see that the social media platforms are now in the position of deciding what is considered hate speech as they patrol the way their platforms are used. And they're having to decide where does the line, what's the line. What do you all think about that decision? And based on the work you do, how should we think about this? What is this concept of hate that we all seem to be, that is, kind of been unleashed with the anonymity of social media in many ways?
I can answer, I think. So, two things about that. I think that social media platforms have to be responsible for figuring out what is hate and taking those sites down. And I think that maybe that's a responsibility that they didn't know that they would have to have. But I think it's really important for us as journalists to hold them accountable for that. So for instance, looking at the Charlottesville piece, I think a lot of the alt-right was initially dismissed because they only existed online as memes. It's these nerdy guys who sit at their computers all day and don't have great social skills, and so no one took them seriously. And I think we saw in Charlottesville what happens when you don't identify those people and you don't sort of take that platform away from them. So I do think it's really important that our work exposes the risks of letting those types of pages and sites and things occur on social media platforms. So that's one. And I also think it's our responsibility in our reporting to hold like Facebook or Twitter's feet to the fire when they're not taking down pages like that. So actually Vice News just came out with a piece today where Facebook had said that they don't tolerate hate speech, yet Richard Spencer had multiple pages on Facebook. And it was one of our digital reporters who reported that, and Facebook took down 2 or 3 of his pages. So I do think that we have a responsibility of helping them sort of identify what hate is and then making sure that they address those issues and take that responsibility really seriously.
This sort of makes me think, and I don't have the answer, is though, where are we going to draw the line when you have people in politics and people running and sort of using hate speech in a masked, somewhat, politically correct way? Where do you draw the line, and using other proxies to kind of cover the hate speech? Does it make it acceptable? I think it's going to be one of those difficult questions.
Yeah, I think that was illustrated with Twitter, when Twitter basically came out and said the reason why they have not suspended the President of the United States is they made a new rule, right? They said heads of state, right? They made an entire new rule to basically carve out one person from their terms of service. that's instructive to me in thinking about the role of social media in our conversation on hate, on racially charged dialogue. It is Twitter and Facebook they aren't free speech communities. This is not the public square. We always have to remember these are regulated speech. And these are communities that have the choice to basically portray and allow what they want to allow. And as far as that goes, Twitter and Facebook are making the calculated decision here to allow hate speech when it does come from official spaces. And so that is going to, I believe, change the nature of the debate over time. As it is becoming more and more accepted in in official spaces, it'll become more and more accepted on social media, and that seems to be the trend we are moving towards.
Right. And I think a lot of what you're seeing when you have Twitter now saying, okay, but heads of state are fine, is they're sort of reactionary. They've let things get to a point where they're now reacting to it, right? And now, instead of, perhaps banning Donald Trump years ago, they have to be like, oh, but here's an exception that we've carved out. And even then, aren't being particularly good at taking down even the most virulent racists, right? I mean, I think that there is an interesting question about at what point, what is hate speech, right? And at what point can you draw that line and strongly define it? But a lot of them have rules, that spell out what they think is acceptable on the platform and what's not. And they don't even hew to those basic rules for the most part.
They're self-imposed rules.
Right, they're self-imposed rules, right? But they don't even follow their own self-imposed rules. And, as Van pointed out, they're private companies. They can regulate the speech on their platforms. You don't have to allow that to happen. Yeah. And we wrote a story about, a sort of really interesting case, which is Cloudflare, which is a network infrastructure company that is very pro free speech and says whatever flows through our platform is fine, except for child pornography, because there are very strong laws against letting that go through your systems, and digital threats, viruses and things like that. But they ended up taking the Daily Stormer offline. We had reported that the Daily Stormer was actually utilizing their platform to abuse people further using their complaint process, which was fascinating. But B had been making claims that they had inroads into the company, which they kind of did. And then one day, after Charlottesville, they made a show of kicking them off and then being like, now you see the power we have. Should we have that power? Which is an interesting question, even though I think it was employed well. Anyway.
So I want to get to sort of a more existential question, which is that throughout the history of the United States, race has been looked at in binary terms for reasons of justifying exploitation. Race is not a binary thing. We see it with Hispanic and Latino, which is not a race but an ethnicity. There's a growing community, or there a growing population of multiracial Americans. How do you look at reporting on race when race itself is complex and will become more so?
Have to think about this.
For me, race has always been complex, and so that's the disconnect for me is presenting things in a way that the mainstream does think is binary, but like my family history, race has always been complicated. I have family members who are white. I have family members who are black but look white. I have family members who we just found out are family members because they passed as white for generations. These aren't things that are complex to me in a way that I do think they are for most Americans to think about. I think we can take what outlets, what families of color have been doing for generations, how they talk about race, how they don't ascribe to the one-drop rule that's created by people to keep people in their place. We can look at what the Chicago Defender was doing when they were discussing race. We can look at what Latino and Spanish language journalists were doing decades ago talking about race. This, to me, is a time for borrowing and a time for examining where folks outside of our large outlets have been doing it, because I do think they've fully grasped that race is complex for a long time now.
I also think it's our job to show the complexities and the diversity in different minority groups, right? So I think, I spend a lot of time covering Black people and how politics and policies affect their everyday lives, right? But that means not just covering how it affects poor Black people or Black people in the South only or Black people in cities only. I think it means painting pictures of sort of that diversity that maybe as somebody who is a minority I take for granted knowing about, right? So it is explaining to your white audience what racial passing is if they've never heard passing as a term. So I think that that's part of our job as well, is to sort of show that it's not just like all Black people are the same, all Latino people are the same, all different minority groups are the same, but in our reporting on different issues to show how different kinds of people within those groups are affected and represented and have different thoughts.
Yeah, I always think when, around election time, people talk about the Latino vote. And then it's like, you have Cubans, you have Puerto Ricans there, and there's like 0.004% Uruguayans, and, Mexico. And so it's really diverse. And I think, at least for my own reporting, I want to look at the nuance. And I think it's important also to look at stories of imperfect people within the communities, especially covering immigration, right? Everybody is like, oh, no, that's not a sympathetic case. I don't want to cover it. We have to cover the non-sympathetic case. We have to go outside that. We got to write a story about the young kid that had to, turn to selling drugs to make a living, or the story of the kid that, tried to kill himself after, his brother went to jail or so forth. So we have to tell those complicated stories, or our audience is going to move away from us, because, people are not perfect. And just because the politics of not of the day, of the last decades are about demonizing and criminalizing people, doesn't mean that we only have to just paint the perfect universe of, no, they are good, they just come for jobs.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with the sort of people aren't perfect, and in life in general, and you can't only look for the most perfect examples to write about certain groups. And when we were writing about a hate crime in Alabama, the guy, he had his problems, and sometimes said things that weren't upon a later review necessarily truthful, but he was in the end the victim of like a pretty brutal beating, and it was a story that needed to be told, even though he was and we put the complexity in there because in some of the responses to other people in the community, and I think that I wanted to add that I don't think that like discrimination isn't getting more complex. Like if you're going to report on discrimination, like while discrimination can manifest itself in complex ways, discrimination itself is not hard. It is not.
Yeah.
All right, let's open it up to questions. Lowell Bergman, please. And please remember to identify yourself and your affiliation.
My name's Lowell Bergman, and I'm with the Investigative Reporting Program. And one of the questions I have is, what's your reaction been in terms of the kind of reporting that you're doing and the community you're serving to the President of the United States, and to the way in which the conversation about race has transformed itself in the last 2 years? How does it affect your work?
I think at Vice, at least, and I was at NBC before Vice, which is a very different reporting environment because it's a traditional network, and traditional networks, while I loved my time there, tend to be more risk averse. But I think...
Well, you remember what Les Moonves said?
What?
Of CBS,
Oh, mm-hmm.
right?
Well,
What's good for CBS may not be good for America.
Exactly. And so that is true still. But I think, at Vice, one thing I think the 2016 campaign did was it opened up a lot of room for us to take risks, and it's a place that's okay to take risks in telling different kinds of stories. So there's stories that we can experiment with and put out there now to start conversations about race that I probably wouldn't have even thought of a few years ago. So for instance, after the election, there was a group of former BLM activists who started this subscription box service called Guilt Box. Now, what it is it's a service that white people can sign up for to pay $100 a month to get a little box that teaches you how to be a better ally to minorities. Now, that's something that would not have existed if it wasn't for Trump in the election, and a story that we never would have covered. But it is something that we ended up covering and we put out there that started a lot of different kinds of conversations about race that were unexpected, right? And so I think that one thing that this presidency and this administration has done is it's opened up sort of a window of opportunity for us to cover these issues in very direct and sometimes even weird, unexpected ways that were not available before, either because they weren't seen as timely or even for us that we weren't even thinking of because we weren't thinking about race in this way necessarily.
I think, one of the things that we've been able to do is to present some sort of evidence, right? So using the tips and the stories that we have in our database, BuzzFeed was able to do a story delightfully called "The Kids Are Alt-Right." That was, it was really good. That was about students being bullied in class using the president's words. And that was sort of this concrete way that we could say this president has affected this conversation in this very concrete way. And another is, while the FBI's hate crime statistics are like relatively shoddy, there are organizations that there are police departments and things like that to do report year by year. And when you look at, say, like the last, I forget how many years we looked at, but let's say the last 6 years of hate crime data quarter to quarter, it goes like, up a little bit in the second quarter and then flat and then down again in the fourth quarter, which is November, And if you look at 2016, what you see is it just shoots up in November. And so what you have then are two pieces of evidence showing that the president has had some effect, and the election at least had some effect on the hate crime, hate incident conversation.
Proof is important too, because I think Charlottesville did the same thing.
Right.
The president came out and said there's like good and bad people on both sides, and here we are, the only people with footage of these guys marching around with tiki torches saying like Jews will not replace us. Like it's pretty hard to argue that these are like great accepting people when you have this like video proof of
Monument
what's going on.
preservationists.
Right. It was not about that statue. So I think that I like the proof thing. I think that's absolutely right.
I think it just allows for us to take a look at things that they've been around since forever, since the foundation of this country, and now they're just like more out in the open, and that's the opportunity to have these conversations. But in Arizona, I'm sure way before that I became a reporter, because that was a state that was born out of a lot of violence. The history that we have. People being deported, people being segregated in concentration camps. Sort of places. Is where I was I lost my train of thought with that. But anyways, I think it's been going on for quite a while, and it's not specific to this election. Like Joe Arpaio was saying, the power of the people. And the kind of reports that you're receiving right now, that was there all along. It's been there way before Trump. What is this saying about the country and voters and their state of mind and our willingness to tolerate a certain degree of hate speech? Or I think we're just barely starting to understand what that is, and I am just very thrilled with projects like the one you guys have, because that's even educating me to understand how deeply that goes and how racism sometimes is part of our everyday life, or we have it incorporated in ourselves, and we're, we are sort of like going through life completely unaware of that. So I think that that's a positive. In terms of my own reporting, I'm just focusing on just trying to put the facts out there, humanize people, talk about the imperfect even more now, just be as real as I can with my reporting instead of shying away from it.
Yeah, we live in a golden age of data now. The last couple of years have been really remarkable in terms of the quantification of racial disparities. I've been looking at Eviction Lab. Matt Desmond has a great data set out. We'd never really studied how many people get evicted in this country, and now we do. There's some good stuff out on the racial wealth gaps. Those, to me, in my sense, have been direct responses, reactions to the president often. He's on the trail and saying, what the hell do you have to lose? And now we have data showing exactly what we have to lose. But actually, in my experience reporting, going and doing environmental reporting, health policy reporting, looking at the wealth and material living conditions of Black people in the South, especially people in really small towns, folks who have been outside of the spotlight for a while, you'd be surprised how little Donald Trump's name comes up in those conversations. I went to Charlottesville a couple of days after all of the violence was over, after all the alt-right protesters had left, and talked to the people in the town there, the Black folks in the town there. And the resonant theme was always, this has been happening. We're getting forced out by the university. Like, there are people who are worried about the Klansmen coming into town, yes, but also I can't go, I can't eat as much as I used to because I'm getting forced out of my apartment by this university. They already have layers of things going against them that have been happening well before Trump. I'm looking at people in rural Mississippi right now, Black folks, and their situation was dire 20 years ago. It's some of the poorest counties in the country. Trump is a manifestation of a trend that's already hit them decades ago, I think. It's blindsided many of us in the more cosmopolitan areas, people who didn't think that this was ever going to happen again. But I guarantee you, folks in the Delta of Mississippi, they've already seen this in their state governments, for example. And Trump is merely, and the national government now are merely just the newest in a long line of setbacks for those folks.
More questions? Yes, please. Please wait for the mic.
Alan here.
Oh, sorry.
I'm
Please.
David Boardman from Temple University. I'm thrilled to see 3 people of color on a panel at an investigative conference, which, believe me, is not the norm. And if you look back at us, you certainly see that.
The only reason I said I would go on this is because it was not going to be all white.
And I spent a lot of time in the Black and Hispanic communities in Philadelphia trying to recruit students to journalism and communication education generally, which is, it's a challenge, as you know, because it's not a cultural norm for people who are going to college to necessarily pursue careers in journalism. And then we find that investigative journalism, even more so, seems to be something that is a challenge to get people of color to go into. And we've failed miserably at it as a profession. And I just want to get your thoughts on that, because I think it's a crisis.
Yeah, Kerner Commission. Again, why do people go into a field that they believe to be hostile to them? Why would they? It's hard. At The Atlantic, at least, we've been having some really involved conversations about diversity, about how to make our what we do more visible to people of color, how to increase the presence of people of color in the newsroom, in our pipelines. And one of the things I think that has stuck out the most is reaching out to deliberately, so making it understood that, we are a place that doesn't just want people on for representation, right? We want to hear their voices. And it's sort of a paradox, because the way you do that is by featuring more people of color. It's by finding people who may not be journalists, I think, often, and having their perspectives be brought to light. It's by developing and promoting the people of color within your ranks and making, I think you've seen over the past couple of years, newsrooms that actually have really small percentages of people of color make great strides by doing diligent promotion of the voices they have, by fostering a community where you can even dissent from your newsroom's main stance. And you've seen the careers of lots of talented journalists of color come about from that. We're nowhere close to where we need to be, but I think there are some promising things.
I think also, going back to sort of like how Trump has changed our jobs and this administration has changed the way we report, I would like to think that sort of the tides are changing and maybe more people of color will be interested in covering journalism. Because I remember when I was looking at journalism school, one thing that really turned me off was I used to say, like, I'm really interested in civil rights and social justice. And those were like bad words when it came to journalism, because it meant that I had some sort of bias or agenda. And I don't think that's true even in just the last 3-4 years. Because Ferguson happened, Baltimore happened. Now race is the center of the conversation under the Trump administration. And I think that minorities who are interested in covering their own communities and covering issues that are sort of geared towards social justice and civil rights, that's the hot topic. And so part of me hopes that that can draw more people into the field, because they'll feel like their voices will be heard and they can cover stories that they feel represent the communities that they come from.
I had a student, a Latina student, I don't know her, I think her parents are immigrants probably, I don't ask, but come to me, and she was covering a story on DACA and how the state was probably going to take away in-state tuition for students, and she says, how do you do it? I'm a little worried. And I said, why? Because I feel sort of bad for these students, and I kind of relate to them as a student, and I feel like I'm being biased. And one of the things that I try to tell them is that we all struggle with that, of course, because we're human when we're covering a story, but it's just so important to have kids that have those unique experiences, that can relate, that come from some of those families, also covering those communities, because the perspective that they bring, the kind of questions that they ask, are questions that no one else is going to think of because they don't come from that background. So I try to sort of ingrain in them that what they think is a weakness is actually a strength, if it's managed, of course. But that's the strength, and I'm a little promotion for Cronkite School of Journalism. It is really great. It's really exciting that they have, for example, a professor like me, like have a really thick accent, working with bilingual students. They have a Spanish program. And one of the most awesome things about it is that we have the kids in the English newsroom come work with us. The students are white, that want to speak Spanish, that are taking those classes, and there's sort of like this cross-pollination and interaction that it's telling the kids from the university level, it's giving them sort of that respect for the work of Spanish-speaking journalists that sometimes we don't see out there. There's often like this divide of, that's the Spanish thing, this is the English thing. And so to see that change and to have this mixture of everybody doing it, and I have a student from the India, that is what we need to start seeing at the university level. So outside in the workplace, that trickles down and everybody sort of sees the value. And that's why partnerships like you're doing with Univision and ProPublica are also so important. It's also giving a place to the work of these journalists that sometimes are not understood, plainly because of language barriers.
One of the things ProPublica does do is, organizationally, is we give scholarships to students who want to go to conferences like NAHJ, NABJ, NLGJA to jumpstart their networks, because I think, as everybody here at this invitation-only conference knows, networks are important. And so we give them the means to go make those connections, which I think is super important.
Yeah, adding one thing to that conversation on sort of the ethos and the founding values of investigative journalism, you're right. The idea of being a staid, unbiased person who sits directly in the middle of things is not appealing to lots of students of color, because I think we've understood for a very long time that the idea of unbiasedness simply really means an upper-class whiteness in lots of places. In my mind, the paragon of American investigative journalism is Ida B. Wells. And nobody would accuse Ida B. Wells of being an unbiased journalist. She had a clear bias for human rights, for equality and justice. Where I think we've gotten confused is Ida B. Wells had no bias when it came to holding power to account. She was skeptical of power in every manifestation. She used her platform in every possible circumstance to interrogate power, whether it be black or white. And that, I think, is something it interests lots of young folks who growing up now in a country where power is more and more concentrated, where inequality is deeper and deeper. The ability to unceasingly interrogate power is I think, a really good way to attract young students of color, young people on the margins into the field. And I've seen most of the young folks who come through programs, that's what they're doing.
Where's our next question? The mic. Yes.
Hi.
Thank you.
I'm George Lakoff from UC Berkeley, a cognitive scientist and linguist. And I've been writing for some time. I wrote a book called Moral Politics back in 1996 on what conservatives were about. Because I was concerned, why do conservatives say are against abortion and for owning guns and against environmental regulations, et cetera, long list. And what came out of it is an understanding that these are based on family models, strict father versus nurturant parent family models. And strict father families, it's an authoritarian, power-based model. And the idea there is that this is not just in the family, but it's the way of the world. That people who are winners deserve to win, and people who are losers, well, they're just not disciplined enough. That's individual responsibility from a conservative point of view. And that gives rise to a hierarchy of who's better than who. The winners are always better than the losers, and so you have God above man, man above nature, rich above the poor, et cetera, and then you get down to things like men above women, whites above non-whites, Christians above non-Christians, straights above gays, all of part of a single ideology. That ideology lies behind arch-conservative thought. It's there in everything, of course, that you see in our president, but also it's behind every bit of conservative Republican legislation. If you take that hierarchy, every bit of Republican legislation fits it right in there, and racism is an implicit part of that. It comes in there, as does sexism, as does homophobia, et cetera. And this is something unreported. It's not something that's in the public domain. Racism is, sexism is, various other parts of it is, but the idea that this is one thing, that this comes out of something deeper that is there and ugly in many respects, is something very important and is unreported right now. There isn't a way in public discourse to talk about strict father morality and why racism and sexism and other forms of things like global warming denial, et cetera, come out of the same place. I was wondering what it would be like to do that. The question is, what keeps you from doing it? What keeps you from saying, okay, reading the book and saying, okay, here it is. Why can't you put it into the reporting that you do?
So I think it is in the reporting. I mean,
Paperback.
if you have them on you, I'd love to take one, but I'll take the name down. But I think a version of this isn't the reporting that I do. It's I think about when I'm thinking about justice. I think about intersectionality in a sense. It's been misused in lots of national conversations around all this, but it's basically a framework to where we can take lots of different injustices, take lots of different overlapping identities, and see where the crisis points are in oppression and in who has power.
Yeah, I agree. I think that even if we're not directly addressing sort of strict father household type mentality, I think that we do try to address some of that in our work. I know one thing that we try to do at Vice is we have a really awesome graphics department that when we're telling a story, if we think people need historical context, we can play around with it. We don't have to be able to show it on television through shooting with a character and having a scene. Like, we do try to take the time to educate people on context for the different kinds of things that we're reporting in our pieces. And I also think that comes across in like little slice of life pieces that we do, right? So like one thing that, two pieces that come to mind that we did that I think kind of get at this is we did a piece on the Freedom Caucus and like what does the Freedom Caucus want and why and how does that play out? And I think in a piece like that, we do address some of what you're talking about. We also did one on a conservative girls conference for high school and college age girls that took place in Dallas, which was sort of like, what do these people think, like what do these conservative young women think of the party and the way it's represented and the way that it's thought about, especially under Donald Trump? So I think, we do try to at least allude to some of these things, but I think one, especially for television, one thing is like, I mean, and I guess this is true of writing too, is the show don't tell, right? So letting that come across in what you're hearing people say, and how the examples that they're giving about their lives and why they believe certain things.
More questions?
I have a question right here. My name is Guy Saperstein. I was a civil rights lawyer, and I founded the biggest plaintiff civil rights firm in the history of America. We did all the big civil rights cases. I have a much simpler question than my friend George. Van Jones is a friend of mine, but aside from him being a friend, what impact do you think his role as a journalist is having on your profession, and is he promoting interest in the profession the way you would like to see happen?
That's a difficult one. We're like looking at each other like.
I think Van's a great guy. He has a great name. And I know him pretty well too, and I do think his role on CNN especially, where he's so visible, you do see. I mean, I see it in the people I mentor already. They see him on television and they say, okay, this has given me the encouragement that I can do this, that I can become a journalist, that I can enter into this type of work. And I think that's, it's always good to have somebody that visible who is a person of color, who is a black man, and talks about being a black man in that space. It's undeniable that I see lots of young black folks who are trying to get into journalism, and they know who Van Jones is, and that he's a big influence for them.
I believe we have a question back there. Yes.
Hi, I'm Carol Bogert from the Marshall Project. We've talked about a couple of watershed moments for media, like the election of Donald Trump or Charlottesville, but I wonder if we could go back to one that's been referenced a couple of times, which is Ferguson. And Van, you mentioned some thoughts you had about how mainstream media covered Ferguson. I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about that. And I wonder if any of the rest of you feel that there was a change in your newsrooms after Ferguson, and what was that moment for the American media?
So I was not a journalist during Ferguson. I was a health policy analyst for the Kaiser Family Foundation. Made a bit of a career shift since then. And this was part of that career shift. I think I'm struggling to recall the exact headlines, but there had been a lot of controversy around the way that slain young black men and black children had been portrayed in places as diverse as New York Times and Fox News. There was a lot of sort of editorializing about what he may or may not have been doing, about his physical stature, about how all these people saw him as terrifying, as a beast almost. And people taking essentially the word of a policeman under investigation as the ironclad truth. That seemed to me to be an abdication of the skepticism that we should have at default for power. And also it was disheartening to see people describe these people, I'm a black man. These are people who are like me. These are people like my little brother who was then 15 years old. It was just sad to see so many folks who I thought were decent people falling into these traps, describing black folks like animals, and totally lacking any sort of skeptical perspective on what may or may not have happened to them. I think we have gotten better. I think you've seen it in some of the coverage around, say, Stephon Clark. You've seen journalists are now more fastidious about avoiding these pitfalls. They do it a little better. There is a lot more, I think, default skepticism at police accounts, which is good. We have a long way to go, and now we're at the stage where I think some of those values are being tested with the ubiquity of video. But I'll say if we were an F during Ferguson, maybe we're in C- now, and we got a long ways to go for the A.
Go ahead, I'll say later.
I was in Ferguson for 2 months, and I think you're right. It was kind of shocking that, I'm a journalist, so I want to hold the news in high regard, and then I see them talking about people who look like me a certain way, and I'm thinking, oh, wow, we have a long way to go in how we cover things. I mean, for instance, I was there covering a protest outside the police department, and I was interviewing people, and the police came, they had a line, and they came with their shield, and they started pushing people. And I ended up on the front page of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and the little box on NBC News where I worked as a protester being hit by police. Now I'm a journalist covering what's going on there, and because I'm young and brown and the police are being aggressive, I'm suddenly a protester, right? And so I think it was also a reality check for journalists and how we talk about these things and whether or not we believe what people are saying is true or not, right? So even like Wes Laurie and Ryan Riley, a black journalist and a white journalist, were both arrested in Ferguson. And I think that did change conversations within newsrooms about how we cover this, and also what our role is, and seeing sort of that we aren't above it either, right? And so I do think it was the beginning of a shift in how we talked about these things, how we thought that we were represented, how we thought we were representing people. And honestly, it was the first time that we started to take other voices very seriously. Like, that's the first time when you can really start seeing sort of legitimate interviews being done with Black Lives Matter. And I think that was a shift, even though, yes, it is happening slowly. I do think it sparked a shift in media.
I think also we've seen, and I want to mention someone that's here, some really good work from journalists after these things happen, looking at different ways, humanizing this issue, looking at the ripple effects for a community, looking at the impact that it has, for example, on the mother of some of these people that were shot, like J.L. Lee, who's sitting over there, who did a wonderful piece. She followed the mother of a young man that was killed by the police, I believe it's in Oakland, for 18 months. And I invite you to look it up. It's in California Sunday Magazine. Just an incredible piece of reporting that brings a whole dimension to to what happens afterwards for that community, what happens to the people left behind. And, you know, it's just not falling into sort of black and white or what happened or who was right or wrong, but this is now the reality for this community, for this family. So California Sunday Magazine, JLE.
I think
It's really good.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I think it was also when the Washington Post decided to start tracking police killings too and police shootings. So from a data perspective, I think it changed some of the ways that newsrooms thought about that.
And The Guardian. Yeah.
And The Guardian.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question. Please.
Hi, this is Jaya. I'm an independent journalist in San Francisco. Thank you, Valeria, for that very kind plug. I have sort of a two-part question, one for Tracy that is more directly related to the Charlottesville episode. I'm very curious how you guys sort of, the behind the curtains talks that you guys had, the three of you, about how you were going to approach and navigate the conversations or the interviews with the subjects, when to push back, when to sort of, and was it ever a concern that, you know, there was that one scene in the van when they were like, Vice News, get out of here, and, you know, how did you sort of toe that line, if at all? And then for the rest of you, I'm curious if, how you think about your audiences. In this time, particularly after the election, we, you know, is a rude awakening in many ways, one of which being that our audiences seem to be, and you know, us too, living in these silos. And so I wonder if you ever think about how much of your work feels like you're preaching to the choir versus trying to reach, you know, quote unquote, those on the other side, and if that's something on your mind at all and how you navigate that.
So for Charlottesville, it was a large team. There was our assistant producer, there was myself, there was another producer, there was Ellie, and we rotated between, I think, 3 or 4 different camera people with producers also shooting. And I think the idea of when to push back and when not to push back, the thing that we knew was there are certain battles you don't want to have with these people, right? Like, for instance, in that hotel room, Chris Cantwell wanted to say that, you know, white people know how to have societies be civilized more than black people, and he says, look at Africa. And you don't want to get in a conversation with Chris Cantwell about colonization because it's not one you're going to win, it's not one worth having, it's not one that's going to be based on any sort of legitimate fact. So we made a decision from the get that those were the kinds of paths we were not going to go down. What we wanted to know is, why are you doing this? What does it look like? And get an understanding of what they believe and why. And so it was sort of sticking to that. Obviously, after Heather Heyer was killed, the conversation sort of, we knew that we had to push back. Like, really, someone died, but we wanted to do that in ways where we weren't, where we were pushing back and challenging him, but not showing our hand too much with sort of what we believed. So there was a lot of thought that went into that, and Ellie had been covering the alt-right and talking to these people on 4chan and Twitter and other places for a long time, and so she sort of knew, based on past experience, when to sort of push back and when to fall back. And so that was something that we did think about, and especially in, you know, when we went into this, we didn't know what was going to happen, and even on Sunday night, we didn't know that Monday our whole entire show was going to be this one story. Those were decisions that we were making in real time based on the idea that this is really huge and people need to know about it, the idea that we were the only ones with the footage, the idea of, okay, so how do we want to, if we're going to do a whole episode on this, if we're going to give them this platform, how do we want to show it, right? And so we made strategic decisions about the fact that there's no track in that piece. It's all narrated by the people that we spoke to in Ellie's stand-ups. We made decisions, okay, we were going to tell this chronologically because that made sense. So those were all conversations that all of the producers were having, our senior producers in Brooklyn were having, and that we were really deciding on the fly. So yeah, some of it was just trying to figure it out in real time, to be honest with you.
And the other question was about how do we feel in terms of the audience? Well, for me personally, I made a leap to write in English a few years ago, and that was a huge change just finding home for all of these stories, all of these voices that I felt people needed to hear in English. I think sometimes it is a little bit about seeing yourself in the shoes of the other person, and you know, you have a central person. I recently followed a family that decided to move back to Mexico after the father was deported, and what was different about the story that his wife was American, white, U.S. citizen, and you know, I was in shock at the reactions that I got to the story, because he didn't really have a great record because he had a DUI. But I got calls from news outlets, different, you know, nationwide, that wanted now that story because there was this white woman talking about deportation. And actually it was really interesting to me to follow through her experience, from her going through this for the first time. And I think it's sometimes finding these new voices that people can see a little bit of themselves in there. The story resonated much more than others that I've been reading for many years, where most of the people were immigrants, and it's like somehow the audience couldn't see themselves in them, sadly. But
I believe we're out of time. Please join me in thanking our panel.